Welcome to Theology Thursday. Today I want to talk about a subject that is very, very important to me personally. When I was in college, I started off as an aeronautical engineer, physics, calculus, all that sort of stuff, but you realize pretty quickly that it's not really that helpful if you are going to be studying for the ministry. So I changed majors to history major. And I love history, and being a history major, I learned how to do research, how to write papers, all the things that are a lot of the things that you do when you're studying the Bible, like how to research what's been written. But something that was a benefit that I didn't think about when I went in is the actual fact that it's history, and how much of the Bible is history. As a matter of fact, the Christian faith is not based on a collection of sayings or thoughts or ideas by some great guru, leader, teacher kind of guy. Like our faith is based on history, people, places, events that have not only historical significance, but also have theological significance as well. So let's work up to and see if I can show you how this goes together. You're probably aware that much of the Old Testament is history. I mean, we start in Genesis with the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and empty, and the Spirit of God hovered upon the face of the deep, and get the creation of day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and all that. And then we get the history of Adam and Eve, and they have children. We get some history about their sons, Cain and Abel. We, of course, have Noah and the great flood. Then, beginning in Genesis 12, we start with the history of Abraham. And the rest of the book of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, are the events of the first families in Israel's history, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then, of course, about half the book is Jacob and really his sons and the relationship between those 12 sons, and especially as it relates to Joseph ending up in Egypt. And then in Exodus, we have the history of Moses and the Red Sea and the building of the tabernacle and the institution of the priesthood. Then the whole book of Numbers is just their history in the wilderness. So Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers are just all history. Leviticus is where we get those, this is what God has said, kind of codes for living. And then we get to the book of Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy starts off with about 3.5 chapters of history, reminding them, here is what God has done to bring us to this point. Then Joshua's history, Judges is history, Ruth is history, 1st and 2nd Samuel are history, 1st and 2nd Kings are history, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are history, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. We're like halfway through the Old Testament before you move out of history. And even the prophets have a lot of history in them. They're connected. They mention nations and kings and kingdoms, and there are warnings that the prophets give, like to the kings and the people, about how to deal with Assyria and Egypt and Babylon, and Daniel's history about these boys in captivity. Ezekiel has a lot of history about the captivity. So the Old Testament is just packed with history, full of history. So why does God put so much history into the Bible? Well, let me give you some reasons why there's so much history. One, it's really hard to know where you're going if you don't know where you've been, if you don't know where you come from, if you don't know the direction that this road has been traveling. So history gives us a sense of where we have been. A second reason why we have so much history is because God acts in history. God delivers His people from Egypt. God calls Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees. God dramatically intervenes in history, and we see this. But even more importantly than that, when we think about history, there are really two things that stand out above all the others when we think about the history that we read in the Old Testament. The first one is God. The second one is people. So let me talk about those in reverse order. Let me talk about people first and then God. So when we think about history, what we read about in the Old Testament, we read about these people is, imperfect heroes. Abraham doesn't trust God, tries to pawn off his wife Sarah a couple times as his sister. Sarah has all kinds of issues with Hagar, her handmaid, and there's all kinds of inter-family dynamics. the 12 tribes that start Israel, we have two brothers that deceive a city and kill everybody. We have a brother that sleeps with his daughter-in-law. Some of the brothers sell off Joseph into captivity. We have a brother who sleeps with one of his dad's concubines. I mean, they're a mess. These people are a mess. Moses gets angry at the people and claims credit from God for himself. Aaron and Miriam fight against Moses. They don't recognize his leadership. They're upset with the fact that he has an interracial marriage, and so God punishes them with leprosy. You just go through the Bible. My goodness, when you get to the book of Judges, they start off pretty good, and the further in the book of Judges you get, the worse these people are, just in terms of personality. David has an affair, commits murder, lies, deceives. Solomon has a whole host of issues with marrying multiple women and allowing them to bring in their pagan deities. Just as you go through the Bible, you discover these saints are not like saints. They have a lot of issues. So it helps us to identify with them. They face the same kind of things that we do. Government authority issues, business issues, employer issues, issues with neighbors, marital issues, child raising issues, parent issues, economic issues, death in the family issues. They're just, and sometimes they handle them better than others. So we look at them sort of as role models, but in a lot of ways we just look at them and we're reminded that's who we are. God communicates to them more as examples of what we really are than always examples that we should follow. Like they are, maybe we could call them stained saints as we look at them. And so when we think about history, it reminds, we can identify with times when they're faithful and times when they're not. We can see ourselves, maybe not in the specifics culturally, but certainly in the way that people deal with all those kind of things. And so the history in the Bible tells us a lot about human beings, tells us a lot about ourselves. Even at our best, we are still stained saints. But a second thing that the history tells us about is God. And there are a lot of things it tells us about God, but I wanted to just hone down on a couple of them. Even though we are sort of kind of failingly faithful, stained saints, flawed heroes kind of people, God is always faithful. Even when Abraham doesn't live up to being completely a person of faith, God's still faithful to him. He's faithful to Isaac when Isaac is not the best of fathers and prefers one child over another. God is faithful when the brothers, 11 of them, sell off their next to the last brother, Joseph. God is faithful when they are angry and disobedient and adulterous and lustful and cheaters and liars and swindlers and every other thing you could possibly imagine. Even with our failed faithfulness, God is always faithful. And throughout their history, even with their succumbing to idolatry and all the other sins that they commit, God is always faithful to his people. So when you and I read the history, yes, we see ourselves as stained saints. Yes, we see ourselves as stumbling along this road of Christianity, wanting to do well, wanting to be pleasing to God, wanting to obey him, wanting to live righteously, but failing, not being completely successful. But our hope is not in our faithfulness. Our hope is in the God who is faithful even when we are not. And this history in the Old Testament shows us the faithfulness of God even when we are not all that we should be. But there's something else that it shows us about God. And that is that most of the time, God does not work in powerful, impressive, dramatic, miraculous kind of fashion. Most of the time, God works in history. Maybe the best example of this is in the book of Esther. Esther is a little short of a dozen chapters, so it's a short book. There are a couple of things that are interesting about Esther. Esther is the only book that is not represented among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, all the books of the Old Testament, we have all or part of them except the book of Esther. And I don't know why that is, but just a trivial point. But there's something very, very significant about the book of Esther. It is the only book in the entire Bible that never mentions God. It just doesn't mention Him anywhere. It's just the history of how this young girl becomes the queen through a long set of events. And you can go back and read the book for yourself to catch those. But how God uses Esther to save His people because of God's faithfulness to His people. One of the primary theological points of the book of Esther is that God's not mentioned. God is at work, but not in some miraculous, dramatic, mountain-shaking kind of way. God's just at work in history. And the reality is this is most of the history of the Old Testament. Not some, God... And there are some places where God breaks in and does something really impressive, like parting the Red Sea. But for most of the history of the Old Testament, we just see God at work, behind the scenes, so to speak. And that's very important for you and me, because the reality is God's work in your life and mine usually isn't dramatic. It isn't split the skies open kind of thing. It's just God at work in your life and mine, putting us in the place where He wants us to be, using us to minister to other people, using other people to minister to us, guiding our lives. I mean, how many times have we looked back at life and said, wow, I could see God's hand at work? That is Bible history. God at work in the history of His people. And we worship Him and celebrate Him for that. Psalm 136 is a part of what's called the Great Hallel, the Great Praise Psalm. And the psalm just over and over and over again celebrates the fact that God's mercy is everlasting. And every verse is basically the priest saying something that God has done in history, and the people responding with a statement about the mercy of the Lord endures forever, or the grace of God endures forever, or steadfast love, depending on your translation. But it's the idea that God has been at work in the lives of His people in history, not always dramatically, oftentimes like with Esther, putting her in the right place, the right person, the right time, working all those details out to accomplish His purpose. Now let me see if I can tie all this together with the root and foundation of our Christian faith. The Bible says that in the fullness of times, Christ was born of a woman born under the law. Think about how God worked in, not just in the lives of Christians, but in the lives of all of history to accomplish His purpose. The Old Testament predicted that it was a curse to be hung on a tree. The Roman Empire, their favorite method of execution, hang someone on a tree, crucifixion. Jesus was crucified. The Old Testament predicted that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Well, we have a census. Everybody has to travel their hometown. So, Mary and Joseph have to travel to Bethlehem because he's of the house and lineage of David. So the Roman census gets them to Bethlehem, not in some miraculous way, just working through history. Now I realize the birth of Jesus is miraculous because He was born of a virgin. But the reality is most of Jesus, even Jesus' life, is just God at work. There are some miracles, but for 30 years we don't read of any miracles really of Jesus. He's just growing up. God is at work in His life. He doesn't have some supernatural kind of calling of the apostles. He just sees them in a boat and says, hey, come and follow me. But He's there. They are there. They can't catch any fish. Jesus says, throw the net over. Now that's a miraculous catch of fish, but the calling is just normal. He just calls Andrew. Matthew's at the tax collector table, and Jesus shows up where he's at and says, come and follow me. Like, nothing miraculous, nothing dramatic, just right place, right time, right situation. Everything is brought together by God to pull it off. And so our faith is based on God accomplishing His purpose in history. Think about this. The story of Jesus is not just a story we tell. It's history. We know where He died, outside the walls of Jerusalem. He was actually buried in a cave, like everybody else. History. He rose again from the dead. History. An actual place that He appeared to people, that He walked on the earth for 40 days after the resurrection. Our faith is built on what God has done in history. So we don't just put our faith in Jesus as some kind of ideal or just the teachings of Jesus. We would put our faith in the person who came into history and lived in history. I mean, history is a very significant part of who we are. Now think about history beyond that. The early church spread rapidly. Well, why did it spread rapidly? Because of God working through history. The Roman Empire had roads that could be traveled. Everywhere they went, throughout Asia Minor and Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, everywhere they traveled was the Roman Empire, and everybody spoke the same language. So there were no language barriers to the spread of the gospel in the early years of Christianity. It's not just by accident. It's the fullness of times. It's God pulling it all together in history. You and I don't just live in history. We see God at work in history. And it's a cause for us to praise Him and to worship Him. So think about the history that God has done in the Bible. How He's just worked in history. How God has been faithful even when we have not been faithful. That God used history to accomplish the greatest thing He ever did. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then to think about the fact that God is still at work in history. And someday, God will pull all of history to a close at the return of Jesus Christ and the establishment of His kingdom. So, just want to encourage you, don't get bored by history, but see the value in history, especially history as it's recorded in the Bible, that it is God's history of what He has done in time. God bless you. Hope you have a wonderful day.